32 years ago, last March, our first grandchild died in the hospital, never getting to come home. He was 4.5 months old. A couple of weeks later, my oldest son, his father, a medical student who was about to graduate from medical school, called me and told me about a Dr. Daniel Wolfelt, who was coming here to Memphis to hold a seminar on thanatology. Knowing that the Greek word thanatos is the one translated death in Scripture, I was interested. Thanatology is a brand new subject in most universities. It hasn't been around very long, probably since Catherine Kubler-Ross wrote her book on death and dying. We've had this kind of study in universities. I went to that seminar. Some of the thoughts that you'll hear today probably came out of Daniel Wolfelt's work, but I became interested in studying grief. And I've been privileged to hold several hundred seminars on grief for the Brotherhood, a subject not very well taught most of the time in most congregations, but a much needed subject. In fact, preachers need especially to know how to handle death and dying here. You will deal with that very often. You'll be with people holding their hands. I remember holding a man's head in my hands while he died. And so you'll be there. And hopefully you'll be there. I also know some preachers don't visit the hospitals, but that's another problem. That's another seminar. But we're going to talk about bereavement today. I want to make a point here, and this point I hope you'll go away with it. Everybody look up here. I need your attention, Tobias. Look up here. Make sure you're paying attention. Don't write. Listen. You're going to hear people, they've even written books on coping with grief. That's impossible. You can't manage grief. Don't ever read a book that tries to teach you how to cope with grief. Each one of you, including this guy right here, grieves differently from the other person. And those 2 points you need to remember. You can't manage it, and everyone is unique in his grief. We have to start there. Grief is a multifaceted response to loss. You ever lost your keys? Anybody here who's ever lost his keys? How'd you feel? Mad? Yeah, that's grief. Now multiply that by 100 when you lose your wife. That's grief. That's what it is. You're angry. We don't want to add to the anger. That's what we're going to try to learn this afternoon, a little bit anyway. Let's not add to their anger. You form a bond with those keys. They're supposed to be in your pocket, right? How many of you have experienced riding with someone else and as you come out to the parking lot, reach for your keys? Come on. I do that all the time. Not forgetting that I'm the one who wasn't driving. But it's such a habit, right? They're my keys. And if my wallet's not there, I panic. Oh my. I start yelling at Dorothy, "Why'd you take my wallet?" You know how wives are. You get angry, fellows. And that may be your first definition today. But grief over the loss of a loved one is physical, social, behavioral, cognitive, and philosophical. Did you write all that down? Won't mean a thing to you yet. It affects every aspect of your lives. Grief does. Whether it's a friend that died, a member of your family, or other companions. You see the word bereavement on this overhead. That's a little bit different from grief. Bereavement is the state you're in. Grief is how you reacted to the state you're in. You can be in a state of bereavement, and how you react to that state is your grief. Anybody here ever been fired? How'd you feel? You were grieving. You were angry, weren't you? Oh, you wanted to quit, huh?
Yeah, I didn't want to work.
That's different. You ever lose a pet? Did you ever lose a sense of your self when you got a low mark on that test? And lose the order in your life? Something's not going right? Grief. It affects us all the time. Now, here's the thing. There's a risk here. And this is what we need to be aware of as preachers. When you're dealing with people who are grieving, you remember that although this is a normal part of our life experiences, there's a risk involved here. And one of the things I'm noticing in the church is we have very limited support for people who are grieving. That's not good. And where there's no support, you can watch a couple who lose a child get so angry at each other that they divorce. They don't have any support, someone there who can help them get through this. I watched it here with one of our own graduates, where she was driving the car one day. There was an accident. His son was killed sitting in the back seat. The daughter in the back seat survived, but the son was killed. He started blaming the wife for her driving. They got in it, and now they're divorced. There's a huge risk when a person is grieving. Dorothy and I and Karen have been bringing a girl to services. Her husband died unexpectedly, and now she's so angry at God she won't come. We know that. We know what's going on with her, trying to work through it. Sometimes her faith is being questioned now. She's angry at God, doesn't realize it. So she's questioning her faith. Why didn't God save So there is a huge risk in this area of our lives. Huge challenges. There are a lot of books out there that you can find on the increased risks that are being studied concerning grief. Even the secular world is becoming aware of how risky your life is at this time. You'll have people who will increase their doctor visits. They just can't figure out why they're feeling so badly all the time. Well, they're grieving, but they feel it physically. I went to hold a funeral for a gentleman. His son was 15. And I watched that boy, and the night I went to the visitation, I watched the boy leave the funeral home. And I thought, something's wrong. And I don't know what made me do it, but I followed him. I've known that family a long time. When we got to the house, I went around behind the house. I could hear something back there. Here he was with an axe, chopping the wood that his father had never gotten through before he died. He just went home to chop that wood. And he was just beating that wood to death, so to speak. He was angry. He didn't know what to do, so he went home and chopped wood. I just stood there and watched him until he saw me, and we talked a little while. I remember a boy whose grandfather fell off of the toilet seat, hit his head on the floor, and developed a bump right there. Well, the boy developed one right there. So you can have empathetic risk, you can have sympathetic risk, you can have social risk, you can have psychological risk, behavioral risk, cognitive risk. All kinds of things happen when people are grieving. Whether you know it or not, Jackie's still grieving. She should. And that's the third point today. There's no time limit on grief. The next time you're tempted to tell someone to get over it, don't. That's like telling that person, forget that person. Why would I want to do that? There's no time limit here. When do you want to quit for remembering your grandparents? Today? Tomorrow? When? No. So, I have a little poem there you're looking at. I'll give you a copy of it later. Let's go to this passage here. Someone.
Let your conversations be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have. For he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. So that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me.
Job lost everything he had, including his health. One of his friends, Eliphaz, the first one whose speech is recorded, told Job, well, you know, nobody ever suffers who hasn't been wicked. We know that Job wasn't wicked. We know that. The reader of that context knows that. But Eliphaz was trying to convince Job, if you get everything right, then God will give all this back to you. That wasn't the point at all. And here's the point with somebody who's grieving. We have to convince him that God's still there in the middle of his grief, not when he gets over it. Dorothy and I were driving down the road one day, and she said to me, why don't we sit close together as we did when we were dating? I said, I haven't moved. A lady walked into a preacher's office and pounded on the table. She said, where was God when my son died? That preacher, very wise, said, in the same place he was when his son died. God didn't go anywhere. But people get angry. You'll hear it expressed in odd ways. You'll hear a wife say, you know what, Keith? If he hadn't gone out there in the garden, I told him not to go out in that garden, but he went out in that garden, got hot, and died. They're angry at him for going out in the garden. No, they're angry at him for leaving them. And so it's expressed. I had two funerals one day, Garrett, of these two older ladies. I visited the families afterwards. And the one son told me, you know, Keith, we knew we should have sent my mom to Florida for the winter because this winter just killed her. She had been down there in a warm climate, she'd still be here. The next family I visited, if we hadn't sent her down to Florida, she wouldn't have got that disease those people had in that old folk area down there. Anger. Why are we so angry when we lose something? Listen carefully. Death is not a friend, it's an enemy. The Bible says so. The last enemy defeated is what? Death. And you and I have to deal with it lots of times in the years we'll spend minutes. I don't know how many funerals I've held. I think close to 1,000. Has to be. In 55 years, probably. One year I held a funeral 2 and 3 times a week when I was at Greg Avenue. There was a military funeral, a military cemetery right next to where Greg Avenue was. And that guy would call me to come down there and do a 5 minutes thing at the graveside. I did one for a lady from Knight Arnold. She would have been a military person. I was the only one at the funeral. One time I stood beside a grave with a little baby in a coffin, little baby coffin, and holding it. The father and I were the only ones there, and he said to me, is that all there is? We carried that little coffin in the back seat of my car from the church building down to the cemetery. All right. Anger. Are you getting the definition? Anger. All right, let me give you some examples now as we think about the different situations of death. Let's talk about the death of a child first. Let's start with a miscarriage. Don't ever make light of that. That is a death. And the mother experiences it and the father experiences it the same way they would if it had been a 10-year-old child. That's a death, folks. It needs our help. A stillborn, that's a death. A neonatal birth, like my grandson, that's a death. SIDS, you know what that is? Sudden infant death syndrome, that's a death. Or I did a funeral for a little girl. She was 10 when she got hit by a car and killed. When I was talking to the parents, the thought came to me and I said, would we have rather had her not at all or for 10 years? Seemed to help them. I don't know if that would everybody. The death of a child, however, is not the worst example of grief. It's a terrible thing. You'll hear parents say, this isn't right, we're supposed to go first, or things like that. Don't ever try to help them get over the loss, though. That's not our goal. That's like trying to get them to forget the child. But go there, fellows. And let me tell you the best time to visit someone, the day after the funeral. Why? Somebody tell me why. Did that thing go off there? Or did I?
When nobody else is there. Everybody's gone home.
On the day of the funeral, they've got 100 people around them. The next day, they're all by themselves. And if you'll go, you'll be a friend for life, folks. They will never forget that. In fact, on the day that you hear of the death, you get to that house right now. And let's suppose you're one of those preachers who never visits the brethren. When you get there, you're going to be a stranger. Is that how you want to be received, as a stranger? No, I don't. And when I get there, I offer to answer the phone for them. Why? Because in the state of mind they are, they won't remember the phone call or what the note was. So I take the phone, I answer it, I put down the note, they can read it later. Somebody called to wish them condolences or something. Do that for them. Offer to go to the funeral home with them. Why do I say that? Anybody know why I said that? What can those funeral directors do sometimes when people charge them too much? You can head that off. Especially, you need to get to know these funeral directors in the towns where you preach. Find out which ones are honest and which ones aren't. There's one down in Hernando that he's helped me so many times. When people couldn't afford this or that other thing, he went ahead and did the funeral anyway. Great fellow. But there's another one across the street that's you charge you double if you can. And so we know that. But we know those funeral directors. If you go to a funeral where Brother Grutter or our Brother Reynolds are conducting, watch us with the funeral directors. Because that's important, fellows. We're trying to help these folks. They're grieving, they don't know what's going on, and so on. The death of a child has a lot of risk to it, to the couple. The next one I want to mention, though, is suicide. I want to challenge you to do something. There are 7 suicides in the Old and New Testaments. Study them. But right now, it's a growing epidemic in our country. More people are dying from suicide than COVID. But I don't see those numbers flashed on the screen every day. They're probably listening to suicide the way they're doing with the COVID deaths. I've never seen such a lie being told out there. When you don't know how to deal with this, don't do it. Turn it over to somebody that knows what he's doing. We don't have a lot of trained people. My youngest son is well trained in this area. But if you're dealing with a parent who loses a child through death by suicide, that parent's at risk. You're going to hear why. I don't know. I don't say that. I just don't know. I just sit there. I'm silent. In fact, some parents get so embarrassed by that thought that they won't discuss it with you. The child, watch it now, hurt their feelings, embarrassed them. And they don't like those emotions, and they don't want to talk about it. Suicide, bereavement is the most awkward time for a preacher or for anyone. I think one of the best ways to help here is just go around and visit a lot. Just be there. You don't even have to say anything. Just show up and say, I'm here. And maybe you can get them to go with you somewhere and visit someone or do something. But it will take a while. Suicide's a terrible time for parents. Terrible time for anyone. Now, what is the most powerful loss of all? A spouse. Please don't forget that. We have ignored our widows in many congregations. You agree with that thought? Why is that so powerful? Well, she becomes part of you. It's Keith and Dorothy. If I'm gone, it's just Dorothy. She lost half of her identity. And who she is. She's Mrs. Mosher. In fact, I've had a lot of widows and widowers tell me that. I lost half of myself. Wow. That's powerful, isn't it? That's a terrible, terrible loss. Well, life won't ever be the same again. I remember Ernie Usry, when he lost his wife, we were at Knight Arnold at this time. And I said to him one day, I said, Ernie, you look like you're doing better. He said, yes, but you don't see me at night. My friend Don McWhorter, who preached at Fayette, Alabama for a long time, died. His wife, Jane, came to one of my grief seminars and told us something she was doing. She said, Don and I had a time for ourselves at night just before we went to sleep where we talked about whatever was going on during the day. She said, I missed those talks. I couldn't go to sleep. She said, I finally decided, you know what, I've got a lot of tapes of his sermons. So she'd start playing one, she could hear his voice. Didn't work. Then she realized she couldn't smell him. So she took his aftershave and sprayed it on the pillow next to her. And when she could smell him and hear him, she could go to sleep. I thought, that story's got to be told all over the Brotherhood. You may not have known Don and Jane McWhorter. Great, great couple, served the Lord for years and years and years. Jane spoke on our lectureship every year she was alive, except the last one when she couldn't come. But her manuscript that year's in the book, even though she couldn't come. And so, great couple. But think about that. You'll have to spend a lot of time with these folks. Our widows don't get enough attention. Think about it. They're never in on the men's work or anything else. And yet they give. They're part of the congregation. We need to pay attention. They're having a terrible, terrible time. We sit every Sunday with a number of widows, and every Sunday I ask them, how is it going today? Just today. And the longer the marriage, the harder the separation. How do you start over when you're 80 years old? How do you start over when you're 102 like Cody? When you preach for a congregation, well, just as an aside, I don't have anything to do with the seminar, but when I preach for a congregation with a lot of old folks, they need to hear sermons on heaven, the second coming, and death, and so on. What's death like, and so on. One of Dorothy's brothers, Bobby, was learning disabled. And when he was 49 years old, he had an aortic aneurysm. Had to be operated on or he'd die. Well, when they operated on him, he died. But when he came down to visit us 2 weeks before the surgery. And I was sitting at the kitchen table one night, and he walked in and he said to me, "Keith, what's it like to die?" Because they told him he might die on the table. "How do you tell Bobby?" I said, "Sit down a minute." From that moment until about midnight, we finally baptized him into Christ, incidentally. But I said, "Bobby, when you were little," and this story has helped a lot of children and widows. I said, "When you were little, how many of you have been, when you were little, your parents would take you to visit someone and you fell asleep at that house? How'd you get home? How'd you get from that house to your house? Did your father carry you? Where'd you wake up? At home. That's death. You go to sleep here and you get carried there. He got that. He understood it. And that particular story, I don't even remember where I heard that story. I stole it from somebody. But it's helped a lot of folks to, what is death? You go to sleep here, you wake up there. Isn't that what Lazarus did? He lifted up his eyes, being in paradise. You're going to meet, and I'll tell you something else that happens with our widows, Jakes. Suddenly the married couple start shutting them out. It used to be that Keith and Dorothy got invited to John and Mary's house, but now that Dorothy's the only one, Mary doesn't invite her anymore. She's a threat to her husband. That's exactly what happens. And so they start getting shut out from the married couples. A lot of bad emotional disturbances. Here's another problem. In every congregation, there needs to be somebody who's aware of probate, insurance, all those kinds of things that will help a widow get through it. All kinds of tasks that have to be completed. Your teenagers can help these widows mow their grass and feed and do whatever else needs to be done around there. I went to the hospital with a student one day, and we visited a fellow in the ICU unit. This guy's lying in the bed there, all hooked up. Can barely move, if he can move anything. And the young man said as we were leaving, "Don't forget, if you need something, don't forget to call us." When we got to the car, I said, "How did you expect that fellow to call us?" So I drove the young man past the fellow's house, to the fellow's house. I said, "Come on." He said, "What are we doing?" I said, "Come on." We went up and knocked on the door. His wife came to the door. I said, "Ma'am, what do you need done?" She said, "The yard needs mowing and I need some things at the grocery store." I said to him, "You mow the yard, I'm going to the store." That's what you do as a minister, fellows. It's not that pulpit that wins souls. If that's what you think preaching is, rethink it. If you watch the widows and they become socially isolated, you've got a problem. They may quit the church. What about the death of a parent? When there's no support to manage the grief, this is the kind of problem for children that can result in psychological harm, fellows. When you don't have a way to support this situation, to take care of it some way, to help the surviving parent if there is one, what happens when both parents are killed in a car wreck? Where's the support? And how does the surviving parent adapt to the other one's death? Sometimes a child will increase in his maturity because his parent died. Sometimes they improve, but oftentimes they don't. They stay angry all of their lives. When I lost my mother, I was already 70. I didn't have the same problem that a 7-year-old would have had. But you watch the child, see if it's shutting out his friends or trying to isolate himself. He's got some psychological damage. Somebody needs to help him. That's why my youngest son did the training he did, because we saw this problem over and over again in children who lost parents. In fact, one-parent households themselves cause this problem of psychological damage. Suppose the teenager is going through a difficult time and all of a sudden dad dies, or mom does, and all kinds of problems. Watch those children. Any of you lost a brother or sister? Most of the time we don't pay much attention to this when an aunt or an uncle dies, a brother or sister. But in reality, my sister and I had the longest relationship in our immediate family of any of us. Our parents were already gone and so on. And so there's a real sense in which you lose your identity again. It's not Keith and Kathy anymore, it's just Keith. She played a significant role in my life. That was another problem. So recognize the fact that when a brother or sister dies, they also have a sense of loss of identity. You all know Roger Chambers. He went through a long grief process here recently, trying to gain custody of his grandchildren. And we talked about that a lot. You wouldn't think about that as a loss, but he felt it was if he didn't get those children. And sometimes you'll have to deal with a family where there's a divorce and one of the parents loses custody. That's grief, fellas. I was so glad that Dennis got married, because had they broken up, I'd have to deal with his grief. That can be causing grief. Any of you fellows had a breakup? Chandler's going, her fault, right?
Yes.
I think most of us get by without professional help. But now is the time for us to become sensitive. Have you stopped to think about what this virus pandemic has done for us? It made me realize how much I missed my brothers and sisters when I wasn't around them. How about you? It made me realize how important the assembly was. How about you? It made me realize about how many things I took for granted. How about you? It's been an eye-opener for lots of people. Fellas, now's the time for gospel preachers to make some hay while the sun's shining. We have the greatest opportunity we've ever had. We're being tested. We're going to pass the test. If we can tell them God's with them, maybe they will. In the United States, we have a cultural problem with death. You fellows weren't around when Kennedy was assassinated, but there's a picture of the funeral procession that's in my mind that won't go away. Standing watching the procession was Jackie, his widow, in her black and a veil, and little Caroline and little John John. And little John John is about 3 then, maybe 4, and he's saluting as the casket passes, drawn by horse and carriage, the way Lincoln was taken to his cemetery. Little John John saluting. No tears. Mama told them, no tears. Not in America, not in public. Had that same scene taken place in Israel, you'd have heard wailing all over the place. We have a different culture when it comes to death in this country. I was holding a funeral in Mississippi of an elder. When the service was over, the girl, his daughter, threw herself into the casket on top of her father's body, screaming, "I'll never see him again, I'll never see him again." A lot of the folks got upset with her and said something to me. I said, no, that's normal for her. What am I saying to you? There's no normal way to grieve, folks. There's no normal way to grieve. Some people cry, some don't. Some scream, some don't. There's just no number way to do it. I will tell you another problem, Jake, that we might have. My friend C.W. Bradley got a phone call one day from a sister. She said, "My dog just died." Well, he commiserated with her about her dog's death. Our neighbors, we had to go and help her. The other night, her dog she had to put him down. And she's grieving over the loss of that dog. It's that doggone grief. I thought I'd lighten the moment for a moment. Anyways, this lady, she said, "My dog died," and Brother Bradley commiserated with. She quit coming to Wooddale. Why? He didn't visit her when her dog died. So you never know why people are grieving. We have a cat that should have died, but it won't. It's 18 years old. Anybody know how to kill a cat? Now watch it. Why did I bring up dogs and cats? Because they grieve. Not the way we do, but they do. When you have two dogs together for a long time and one of them dies, watch what the other one does. Starts looking for it. That's what we do. We start imagining. You'll hear people say to you, "You know, I walked in the door the other night and started talking to him and he wasn't even there." I realized finally. It happens. It's normal. Don't worry about it. When Jane Goodall did her work with chimpanzees, she noticed that when one died, all the others. Elephants do the same thing. They'll gather around the elephant and so on. So they realized something happened. I want to give you a site for you to look on the internet. Will help you. It's called the Grief Recovery Institute. www.thegriefrecoveryinstitute.com. I do not know a thing about what I'm about to mention to you. But there's a thing called PTSD now that they are recognizing and have since 1970 probably. Post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's a type of grief. If you fellows will email Bobby Gayton, Gayton, a graduate of this school, you can get the email from Miss Annette, I think. He will probably sell you one of his books on that subject. He's an expert in it. He lives down in Georgia. He helps a lot of military people. Bobby is a graduate of this school and a minister. But he's made his ministry to help all these veterans of the war. That's a type of grief. I don't know how to handle that. He does. I don't know a thing about that particular difficulty. Let me give you another point and then we'll take a break. I don't know how you're numbering these, but my next point is to define grief as deprivation. Deprivation. One of the fellows I was able to study under whom I was able to study, Dr. Parks, P-A-R-K-E-S, told us several times in class that people are looking, they're searching when they're grieving. They're trying to find whatever it was they lost. My grandson, who has a doctorate in religious psychology, indicated the same thing to me, that when they do analyses of these people, a lot of them are looking, trying to find something, and they can't. They feel restless, tense, sleepless, depressed. They can't find it. One widow here described her grief as exhaustion to me. And I thought, that's Dr. Parks. She's looking and can't find it. She's getting exhausted from trying to find peace. I've met people who lost their appetites when they were grieving, others who ate more. Depends on how they do it. Anxiety becomes a part of this. And one of the things you'll have to hear, just listen to it now, you don't need to judge it. They will tell you about the dreams they had about the deceased. I don't know how to get into this next one. Cody, you want to help me be discreet? A sister at 9 Arnold, 84 years old. Husband died. She called Dorothy and me and she said, I have to talk to you. I don't know how to describe what she said. If I said she missed him, would that help you where I'm going?
Yes.
Or do I need to be more specific? She missed him physically, and she's 84 years old. I forgot she wasn't dead. And that becomes a problem for the widow and the widower. I hope you don't have to deal with it, but it may be mentioned to you, or she or he may say it a little differently. They feel lonely, fellows, but they feel lonely sexually. And sometimes they'll make an error in judgment. And they'll tell you about the dreams they're having and so on. It's all normal. Just listen. One of your best responses to this kind of thing is, well. Collins describes this as errors in judgment, Dr. Collins does. Dr. Lewis, in his book, writes, one unusual effect of grief is that some mourners take on and begin to show some of the characteristics of the deceased person. Well, usually in about 2 years, such intense moments fade a little, but they never get over it. It's a difficult, lifelong process of healing. And Dr. Free says in his book, it takes care of itself, and that's the best that we can tell them. You ought to be there to help them, though. I recommend they go to a doctor, too. Sometimes they'll forget. Go to the doctor. Get you something that'll help you sleep. Nothing wrong with that. But learn your role. And when we come back from break, I'm going to take a break. When we come back from break, I want to help us learn our role, what that is as a preacher. Hey, wait a minute, I've got it on my, can't I send it to you from my computer? How do I get out of this thing? Escape? It helps, the family helps, friends help, ministers help, doctors help, who understand. But all of us should learn our roles. First of all, what's the nature of your relationship to the griever? Number one here, on approaching a grieving person, unless you are extremely close to the survivors, wait until the funeral to make contact. That's generally. To a preacher, go to the house immediately, offer to answer the phone, offer to go to the funeral home, and so on. But if you go there as a stranger and not a friend, that's a problem too. That's why we need to be visiting the members. So when we show up, we're a friend, not a stranger. So whatever your relationship is to the griever, and however the death took place, is involved in what you say to that person. What's the spiritual nature of the person to whom you're talking? Is this a Christian or a non-Christian? What's going on? Now, before I leave that point, I want you to put in your notes, evasion. When you're approaching someone who's grieving, he at the same time is going through evasion, psychologically speaking. There's a new reality in his or her life, and he is evading, if he can, that new reality. That's his immediate response. He may describe it as numbness. Some have described it as denial. Others have called it shock. I call it evasion. He will not be reconciled to the new reality. He's evading that process of reconciliation. That's immediate reaction to death. And there is nothing I can say to make it all right. What's wrong, Josh? Oh, what happened? It's my fault. It's not up there yet.
It's coming.
What happened?
He just went to sleep.
Did I breathe on it? It's my bad breath did that, fellow. What was I talking about? Shock and denial?
Evasion.
Yeah, denial's not a river in Egypt. This will result in confusion on the part of this person. Realize that this person is in a state of disorganization and confusion. Please be very careful about what you say. Sometimes you'll hear guilt, sadness, emptiness, but rarely reconciliation, because the person is in a state of evasion. It's almost as if you walked up to the person and they shied away from you physically. Oh, here's another person I have to have in my life. And so a lot of studies have been done on how to approach people who are grieving. If you get to speak to a survivor, don't say much. I just told someone a few minutes ago, tell me your story. I need to hear his story. He doesn't need to hear mine. You know, Josh, when my uncle died, boy, he didn't want to hear that. He didn't want to hear that. It's not my story, it's his. So we try to express sympathy without being too dramatic. Going on about all the suffering you went through. Well, I went through just the same thing you did when you didn't go through the same thing I did. I just told you a while ago, everybody grieves uniquely. You need to listen, because if the person wants you around, he'll let you know. The person I talked to a while ago walked up to me. I didn't walk up to him. He wanted to say something to me. That's the point. When Brother Bland's son was killed, I rushed down there to Coldwater, Mississippi, and went in, and he and Terry were standing there, and I didn't say a word. There's nothing I could say. I had nothing to say. Went to the funeral home with them. As we were standing there, the couple walked in whose son had been driving the pickup in which they were both killed, and the first thing out of her mouth was, "Now my son wasn't at fault." Now there's a thing to talk about in the funeral home. And I said, "Brother Bland, let's go over here." I got him away from that. All she was worried about was the lawsuit, I guess. Look at number 7 there, fellows. If applicable, really no words are needed. Let me tell you the finest thing you can do if someone is grieving. This is all you need to do, fellows. And if you do any more, it's unnecessary, and it just gets people upset. I'm thinking about you. That's it. Did you hear it? That's it, fellows. That's all you need to do. I'm thinking about you. Not I'm sorry. You know what happens when you tell them you're sorry? I've seen it happen many times. What are you sorry about? You didn't kill him. You make them angrier than they were when you started. You could say I'm sorry for your loss, maybe. But just to say I'm sorry about what? What did you do? You're walking into a person's life when he's the angriest he's probably ever been. Don't make him more angry. I remember Jerry Barber at my grandson's, at the cemetery, in fact, said to my daughter-in-law, "I'm thinking about you." Perfect. And she just fell apart almost when he said that. What else can I do? I can't restore the loss. I'm thinking about you. I'm praying for you. It'd be the same sentence, but I'm thinking about you. How do I make that roll, Josh? I won't it move? Here goes. It's appropriate they tell me to email. It is not appropriate to text. I don't know why that is. I don't have the study on it. But the information I have is it's appropriate to email, but not text. Sometimes the person will post, we get a notice on social media, my wife does, I don't get on. Incidentally, if you got a friend request from me on Facebook, it's not mine. I don't know who did that, but somebody's playing games with me. I'm not on Facebook, so I don't have time for that nonsense. I don't care what you had for breakfast. If they post it on social media, I'm told it's probably okay to send condolences on whatever they posted. But the best thing is to go and be there, so on, especially if you're the preacher. Now I'm going to give you some things to talk about here that you can fill in here. Why? Have you ever been told by your mother, if you can't say something nice, don't say what? Anything at all. All right, you all heard that. Same thing's true of a person that's grieving. If I can't say something comforting, then please don't say anything at all. Let me give you a few things not to say. Let's start with that. Things not to say. I heard this one at a funeral for a child and heard a lady say to the mother, "Well, isn't it wonderful you now have an angel in heaven?" I don't usually like to slap people in public, but that woman really needed one. That mother didn't want an angel in heaven, she wanted her child. Christian or no, she wanted her child. She's grieving. Why tell her something like that? It's nonsense. Besides, the child is not an angel. She's a child. How about this one, fellas? I worked with a man who graduated from this school. We worked together at Greg Avenue. Malcolm Leath, Leath. Malcolm was very hard of hearing. In fact, he had hearing aids. Malcolm loved to make toys and other things for his grandchildren out of wood. He had a little wood shop, and he loved to do that. He got his wood source at a local garbage dump. You go down there and get scrap wood. One day he was studying the book of Ephesians, set his hearing aid down beside his New Testament, left them there, decided he'd get up and take a break and go down to the dump and get some scrap wood. The next thing I knew, I got a phone call that Malcolm had been murdered. We found out later that there was a man there at the garbage dump that confronted him. The guy was dressed in army khaki, had a AK something, 47 is it called, emptied a 50-round clip in Malcolm's body. Blew his left hand right off of his body. He shot him so many times. At the funeral, there were so many people there out at the Memphis Funeral Home on Witten Road out there that people were standing out in the parking lot trying to hear the funeral service. A Baptist preacher walked up to Martha and said something to her that I've heard said in preaching, in sermons, at funerals, and it is so unscriptural and so ugly and so wrong, but Martha had the answer. This Baptist preacher said to her, have you heard this one? After all, God doesn't put on us any more than we're able to bear. Martha looked at him and said, are you telling me that if I hadn't been so faithful, Malcolm would still be living? That's the answer to that nonsense. The Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible teaches just the opposite, that everything that happens to us can happen to anybody. 1 Corinthians 10:13. God doesn't put it on us. He doesn't sit up there and punch his computer and say, what is going on here?
It's going to sleep again.
Old computer. I think it's as old as I am is the problem.
Needs a hearing aid, keeps going to sleep.
It needs a hearing aid? That's what the problem is. Okay, have you heard that one? God doesn't put on us anymore and we're able to bear. Please don't say that. This is one I've heard on so many occasions. Well, Mitchell, I know you lost your wife, but it was her time. Well, how do you know it's her time anyway? I mean, what was her time? I heard this one said to my daughter-in-law by her mother when my daughter-in-law's son died at 4.5 months. Her mother said to her, now, Cindy, you need to get over this. You can have another one. I've heard preachers say that to women who had miscarriages. You talk about increasing someone's anger. You can't have another one like that one. Edwina Woody is sitting with her dying husband right now. Jim is 94, I think. I saw him yesterday. He's not responsive anymore. And sometimes I hear preachers say to people, to a woman like this, she's waited on him hand and foot for months. This preacher said to a lady like that one time, well, aren't you glad to be over that burden? Burden? Do you know when your children have to take care of you, they're learning something? Don't worry about that. When I die, I want 50 people around my bed wailing at my loss, don't you? Won't happen. I'd be like Herod and pay them, I guess. And then Albert said he's just going to have a party. And this one. Well, you know what? Now you have time for yourself. How'd you like to say that to a grieving person? I've heard it said. What'd you say, John?
Sounds like a curse.
Almost. Let's talk a little bit about some things we should be saying. I already gave you one, which I think is the best one. I'm going to give you a list here that I have added to, and I got this off the internet, some of it. And I call it 64 of the best things to say to people who are grieving. Let's go through them. Maybe one will stick with you. Maybe one will fit the situation with which you're dealing. People ask me that all the time. Keith, what should I say to someone who's grieving? I've had that question 100 times in seminars. What should I say? You know my first response? There are no words. And that's a good response. There are no words. That's in essence what I said to Billy when his son was killed. I said, there are no words. I don't have anything. Yeah. Epiphania, you can talk to me about your sister anytime you want. That's a good thing to say to somebody who's grieving. You tell them you're ready to hear their story. You can talk to me about your mom anytime you want. 5 years from now, you can talk to me about your dad anytime you want, Josh. 10 years from now, 50 years from now. Well, 50 years from now, I won't listen. Unless I'm 131, like Abraham. This one helps people coming from me, and it will help them coming from you as a minister. You can tell them, whatever they tell you, say, what you're going through is normal. They need to hear that. It's not abnormal to scream, cry, beat the wall, whatever, knock down a door, whatever you did, it's normal. Just remember you have to fix the door. Josh, your dad was a wonderful man. That's a good thing to say. Your brother was a wonderful guy, if that's your brother that died. I got Billy to talk about his son right away. Terry would not talk about him for 3 years. It's normal. One reaction different from the other. And that's something I try to tell people. Grief has no expiration date, folks. Grief has no expiration date. One lady I walked up to, she was seated because she couldn't stand. She was in her 90s herself. And she said, I just can't. And I said, you don't have to talk. I'll just sit here beside you. You don't have to talk. I'll just sit here beside you. My son, who had just lost his son, came over and sat down beside me and just put his arm around me, and we just sat there. Didn't need to talk. And sometimes just touching the person's hand is enough, or his shoulder, her shoulder, or his hand. Sometimes they'll say, well, I don't want to be a bother. Well, how you answer that with a grieving person? Well, when you really know the person well, just sit down, touch her shoulder and say, I'm thinking about you. I'm praying for you. I always will pray for you, whatever. I love you. We had a sister at Gregg Avenue. I'm not going to go through all 64 of these. I'm just trying to give you an impression of something. We had a sister at Gregg Avenue whose mother died at the age of 102. In fact, when Granny was 98, we had a birthday party for her at the building. And I said, Sister Nicholson, I've never known anyone 98. She said, neither have I. Anyways, when Betty came, when I walked in the funeral, Betty, her daughter was there, and Jim. And Betty said something to me, and I said, Betty, thank you for sharing Granny with us. It just built her up. She just loved that. That's a good line. Thank you for sharing that life with us. Something good like that helps. Sometimes you can write a note, fellows, and give it to the person the day after the funeral about the time that her loved one helped you. That is so wonderfully received by people. I got a note from Mike McDaniel one time after my grandson died. It was so helpful. And I've learned to write notes to people in that case. And how they've crossed my paths and how they helped me. Sometimes they want to share the family album with you. And just look at those pictures. Something like this can be said. I can see how those pictures are so precious to you. how much you loved each other. That's important to them. Josh, is it okay to be not okay? I heard a child say that. He said it's okay not to be okay. That's a good line. I think that's the idea. Things to say. I'm thinking about you. I'm praying for you. That kind of thing. When the St. Helens mountain, the volcano exploded, National Geographic ran a special a series of pictures showing a lady who was trying to find her parents in this awful scene. And because of all the ash that was falling, the lady is shown in these pictures all black and tears streaking her face, and she looks tortured. Why? She's grieving. And that picture in National Geographic, what year would that have been? Anybody remember?
1980 maybe?
Maybe you could look in the National Geographic to find. But that picture, to me, is a picture of grief. She's black, tears streaming down her face. She can't find her parents. She did later find them. But at that moment, she's grieving. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 10. First Corinthians 10 is an illustration of the last verse of 1 Corinthians 9. As Paul explained why he lived a self-disciplined life. He didn't want to be a castaway. Is that possible for a Christian? He said it happened to the Jews in the old times. So he illustrates that it's possible for a Christian to be a castaway, 1 Corinthians 9:27. He says, "Moreover, brothers, I would not that ye should be ignorant, that all our fathers were under the cloud and passed through the sea and were all baptized unto Moses. They're all saved from Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. They're saved. They all ate the same spiritual meat. They were of one mind, drank the same spiritual drink because they drank of the rock in Horeb, Christ. But," look at that word, "with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." Well, why are you telling us this, Paul? It's our example. If we start lusting after things as they lusted or become idolaters, underline that word, as some of them were, or they commit fornication as they did, they lost 23,000 one day and 1,000 the other day. It's 24 altogether. They tested Christ, were destroyed of sermons, murmured, were destroyed of the destroyer. And all of that is an example for us. Wherefore, let him that thinketh he, see the TH on the end of that word? Standeth. The one that keeps on standing in the wrong way. When they got out in the wilderness around Sinai and did all these ugly things, Moses had left them to go up on the mountain to get the Ten Commandments. Joshua was halfway up the mountain. They had no leader, physically speaking. Thought they were all alone out there in the wilderness. So they turned to idols. They turned to worldly things. They made a golden calf, trying to figure out how to have something to take care of them. They were sitting out there at the foot of Sinai thinking, nobody's ever been troubled like this before. Nobody's ever had the trial we've had. This is the most horrible thing that's ever happened to anybody. We're all alone out here. Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth alone take heed, lest he fall. For, now watch the connection. There hath no trial, King James has temptation. This is an outward trial, taken you, but such as is common to man. If it can happen to Keith, it can happen to me. I'm not special. I didn't lose a loved one because God was punishing me in some special way. It happens to everybody. There's nobody exempt from this problem in the world. And don't ever think you're standing alone. What's the way to escape? He gives it to you in the verse, but God is faithful. He didn't go anywhere. Here they are at Sinai thinking, we're standing all alone out here, let's make an idol. No, you're not alone. God didn't go anywhere. He will never leave us nor forsake us. Who would allow you to be tested above that you're able? You're never going to get a problem that anyone else can get. That's not going to happen. Garrett, you could lose your wife, so could I. That's just because we're humans. He calls this idolatry, verse 14. Why? You're worshiping yourself. The first time I met Maxine Hill, she asked me to do her funeral. She was suffering from pancreatic cancer. On one occasion, she survived that thing for 10 years and so. But on one occasion I said to her, Max, have you ever asked why me? Her response was 1 Corinthians 10:13. She said, why not me? I'm not special. Grief is normal, right? It's the way God helps us get through this, and He understands it. Let me prove that to us. Would everyone open his Old Testament to Jeremiah 15:18, please? Jeremiah was disowned by his own family. His hometown of Anathoth turned its back on him. The Jews would not listen to his preaching. He got fed up, Jeremiah did. In fact, he got so discouraged, he decided to go into the motel business. Of course, the text says a dwelling in the wilderness. You're going to start a business, Noah. You're going to leave preaching and become a businessman. He's angry at God. He's grieving over his situation. But notice what he says to God. Verse 15, chapter 15, verse 18. Why is my pain perpetual, Lord, and my wound incurable, which refuses to be healed? Why do I keep hurting? Wilt thou, watch what he says to God, will you all be altogether unto me as a liar? You want to say that to God tomorrow? And as waters that fail? God, did you lie to me? You made me your prophet. How come I'm not successful? Now you would think that God would reach down through the heaven there and slap Jeremiah. Watch what God says to him. This is amazing to me. This is your father, fellows. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, if you return, go back to work, Jeremiah. No rebuke for what Jeremiah said, because God understands that reaction of human beings is normal. When his son screamed on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, God understood that. When you're suffering that much, that's how you cry. The psalmist said so. Jesus just quoting Psalm 22:1, in fact, where the psalmist finally said, I knew he hadn't hid his face from me. I knew he was listening. I just felt that way. If you've never been that low, you've never known what grief is. You will. But understand something else. God understands it. So he just tells Jeremiah, go back to work. If you return, then will I bring thee again, and thou shalt stand before me. Just go back to work, Jeremiah, and everything will be all right. People hurt him, and he was grieving. God understood it. I hope you'll teach the congregations where you go that when your brethren are hurting, the best lamentation song is sung by a whole lot of folks. The more we can gather around these folks, the better off they'll be, and the better our work will be. Let's jump to another point here. I don't even need that anymore, actually. Years ago, I mentioned her name earlier, Catherine Kubler-Ross wrote a book on the 5 stages of grief. How do I get that other thing back here, Josh? I can't hit that red circle. There it goes. She wrote a book, and a lot of people think that you go through these stages, and once you're through them, it's over. That is absolutely error. That's absolute psychological error. The stages, there are 5 of them. Let me give you the list of the stages first, and then make some thoughts for you. The first one I mentioned a while ago that I call evasion. Most psychologists call it denial. The second stage is full-blown anger. It goes something like this in practicality. Did you hear about so-and-so? No! And then you get angry. The third stage is bargaining. Well, you know, if he hadn't gone out in that garden, well, if he'd have seen the doctor earlier, if that doctor had, they start to bargain about it. The fourth stage is depression. 2 types of depression are associated with grieving. The 5th stage is acceptance. The problem is, you can go through all 5 stages every year of your life or every week. They don't always come in that order. Sometimes just one will return. Sometimes I can hear a word and my grandson's death will be right there. Or hear something in a song because he lives. I'm reminded right away what's going on there. And that's 32 years ago, folks. It shouldn't be fresh on my mind, but it becomes fresh on my mind right away. Let's talk about denial for a minute. When my father was 60 years old, he was diagnosed with bone cancer. When he died, his body weighed 65 pounds. I visited him in December. He died in February. He lived up in Erie, Pennsylvania. We were never very close. He's not really my biological father anyway. But here he is suffering from bone cancer, and he asked me to go down in the basement of his house with him, so he was going to tell me what he was going to do when he got well. People do that. They just deny the situation. It's a defense mechanism, psychologically speaking. It helps us stem the immediate shock. Some people blot out the words, some people hide the facts. It's only a temporary response, though, and it doesn't last very long. Because eventually you become not in denial, but angry. And this is painful. Most people are not ready for it. Sometimes this anger will result in the breaking or destroying of an inanimate object. People punch holes in walls and smash dishes and anything to try to get rid of this feeling. But sometimes the anger is at complete strangers, which is really odd to watch, but it's normal. Other times it's directed at the friends or the family or at the one who's dying. That's not rational, we say, no, but it's normal. Why? Because that person's causing me pain and I don't like it. What kind of pain? Emotional. And I don't like this feeling. Makes me angry. I resent that he's causing me this pain. They don't want to say that. They don't want to admit it. But eventually they'll have to discuss it if they're going to heal. We even feel guilty for being angry. And that makes us more angry when we're grieving. When my grandson died, Cindy told me that she got on her stationary bike and imagined that every doctor who had mistreated him, they made several mistakes why they died. But she imagined she was running over them in her bike. She was so angry at the doctors. Ministers will deal with death and dying all the time. Don't let that make you immune to their suffering. We had a teacher here who actually told the students that if they cried at a funeral, they weren't being professional. I confronted him about that. I said, I read in a book somewhere that the best preacher who ever lived cried at Lazarus' tomb. Did you guys read that in a book? Now, I don't write on the funeral sermon, cry here, weak point. But if it happens, it happens. You're a human being. Don't worry about it. I've watched doctors cry when they had to tell the patient they weren't going to live. And incidentally, that's good advice for us preachers when we're talking. Sometimes the people whose loved one is dying will ask you, what should I ask the doctor? Ask him anything. Ask him anything you want to know. Make him spend some time with you. It's all right. Ask your questions and get your answers. This bargaining idea is normal. They're reacting to their feelings of anger, helplessness, vulnerability. You know, Keith, if only we had, we should have gotten a second opinion. In fact, my son and his wife headed off this situation by calling all over this country and Canada, even one place overseas. We asked doctor after doctor about what could be done, and they all told us the same thing. They're giving you the best treatment where you are. You know, I asked God to, yes, I know you did, but you can't bargain with God. But they start bargaining. If only, if only, if only. and then depression. And two types. This has to be understood by preachers, fellows. The first type of depression you'll have to deal with, and they'll have to deal with, is the reaction to the practical implications from the laws. They start worrying about the costs and the burial and so on. That's not abnormal, that's normal. One woman said to me, you know, I'm spending less time with my children than I ought to. I said, she was depressed about that. I said, ma'am, that has to be with the situation you have. Just reassured her she's doing all right. I've watched people's face almost smile when I said to them, it's normal what you're going through. It's just normal. Don't worry about it. The second type of depression is more subtle, fellas, and more private. We start realizing we have to separate ourselves from the loved one. We have to say goodbye. And that's depressing. And these people simply need a hug. And that last one, a lot of folks never get there. When death is unexpected or sudden, it's hard to get to acceptance. It's hard to be calm when these things happen. Don't worry about it. It's normal. Some have added one more to this list, and I'll give it to you here. What happened? What happened? Is everything okay? Let's take a break. I'll come back. Some information one time on 12 stages. I don't know, people add things and take away. Just keep in mind that just going through these stages doesn't mean you're through. They're just trying to describe the emotions that people have, and they can have them over and over again. But one of the things that is known now is once you are in a state of depression, you begin to test things. They call this stage testing. You get overwhelmed by the darkness of depression. You try to figure out ways to escape the darkness. This is a dangerous time for a widow who may turn to some fellow who will take advantage of her. This is a risky time for some people who turn to alcohol to ease the pain. It's a risky time for even for Christians who reach out to the wrong people for help, or they treat themselves with drugs. A lot of people are treating themselves with drugs today because they're in depression. Some people just go back to their normal routines, but they're still grieving. And so there is a period that they're calling testing, and professional help is needed here. If you have someone telling you what's going on, see if you can find professional help for him, like my son is, or someone like that, who is a professional and can help them. Incidentally, we sent that book. Did everybody get one? I sent it to everybody. If you already have one, why? Here's a list. Who wants to make this copy? I just noticed this. I got it hung up. Here's 10 stages of grief, if you'd like that one. That's another one I found. Let me talk to us for a few minutes about the myths that are perpetrated about grief. Myths. A myth is a female moth. She's not a myth, she's a myth. You know what a myth is, don't you? Fanciful story. If you've ever wondered why the American culture about death is so different, you and I live in a society that's taught how to get, how to acquire, how to succeed, not how to lose. We don't like losers. So we're not taught how to let go. Some societies are taught how to let go. We're not. In fact, in some people's minds, death is unnatural. You failed when you died in this society. It's a narcissistic injury if I die. I think Americans look in the mirror and say, "Don't you ever die, you handsome devil, you." And one of the most popular myths I just went through with you. There are 5 stages, and you go through them in an orderly fashion, and then it's over. That's the American myth about the stages of grief. In reality, Jakes, grief is more like riding a roller coaster than anything else. Up and down. You ever been on a roller coaster?
No.
You never have. I need to take you.
No.
Yes.
I don't want to go.
Well, you're living, aren't you? That's a roller coaster.
That's the
Grievers just go back and forth. The emotions come and then they go, and so on. Another myth in this country, and I kind of hinted at it a while ago, is about mourning and grief. Grief is what's going on in your mind. Mourning is different. It's what you're doing. Are you crying, beating the wall, breaking something, yelling at someone? I don't know. Where are you going? What are you doing? That's mourning. And in this country, big men don't cry, you know. Men don't cry. Well, they do. In fact, tears are a great gift from God. It breaks the tension. But mourning and grief are two different things. Another myth that we have to face is this word closure. We'll put that criminal to death and the family will get closure. Hogwash. I'm going to grieve less because they put the guy to death that killed my mate? I don't think so. That's a big thing now in secular circles. We have to have closure. What if you never get closure? Where's Moses buried? Who knows where Moses was buried? One fellow fell asleep in Dr. Nick Dixon's class over there at Freed Armament one day, and the boy woke up and he said, "Where was Moses buried?" He said, "Oh, I knew, but I forgot." He said, "Look there, the only person in history ever knew, and he forgot." We don't know where he was buried. If you guys had closure, we don't know where Moses. How are you going to get closure? Are you worried about it? That's such a big myth. We always are grieving until we die ourselves. How we hold it changes as we grow. The depth of it changes, but it's still there. What was your father-in-law's name?
Delane.
Delaney?
Delane.
Delane. Can you spell?
Delane.
Oh, I like that. That's unusual, Delane. What kind of a man?
Cowboy.
Christian cowboy?
Yes, sir.
Oh, well. Did he ride horses?
He did.
You got his hats?
Some.
I like the way your face lights up when you talk about him. You got to tell me your story sometime. Did you marry your wife just to get to be his friend, or no? We never forget, fellows. Don't try to forget. There's no such thing as closure or coping or any of those words. If you haven't learned anything else today, at least learn that. It doesn't exist. Some people think we have to let go of the person who died. Why? Where's that written? Did you know what I read in a book the other day, Brother Chandler? I read about the death of the Son of God. And that's 2,000 years ago. Can't we get some closure? That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard psychologically. Next time, and I've read books by psychologists talking about closure. What in the world? Well, I closed the door, but the wind's still blowing out there. I don't know what that helped me. Closure. What happens in reality is we incorporate his memory or her memory into who we are. That's what happens. It lives inside of us. It's a relationship that's emotionally bound, and it's intact. And as long as I'm living, my grandson is still alive. He's in my mind. He's in my heart. He's in my memory. I've already talked to you about this one, but one of the biggest myths about grief is that it's the same for everyone. It is not. It isn't even equal for everyone. It's absurd to say to someone, "I know how you feel." I can never experience what you experienced. I didn't know the person the way you did. Your grief is unique to your thinking. It's unique to your relationships. I hope you'll be able to teach the people where you are. If you're sitting in the living room someday and talking to her, and you remembered before you went that this was the day of their wedding anniversary, so you went to be with her, she will just tell you again and again about him that day. That day is so alive to her again and again and again. In fact, what I teach people to do is when you have lost a loved one, sit down and write him or her a letter. Tell him how you feel. Tell him how you feel. Tell him how you feel. It's a myth to think that grief is the same for everyone. It's a roller coaster. I remember the day my son told us, my son and his wife, Cindy, told us they were going to have a baby, our first grandchild. We went to some fast food place, and my son, who is as weird as I am, pulled a jar of jam out of his pocket and set it on the table and said to Dorothy, "Guess what Cindy and I made?" And Dorothy said, "Jam?" I said, "No, they made a baby, Dorothy. That's why they brought us here." Well, that's an exciting announcement. 4.5 months, or 13.5 months later, he's dead. Well, his grief is different from mine. But I want to tell you how deep it gets. Everybody stop typing. This is my personal account. I don't want you to retell it. James died in the Regional Medical Center here in Memphis, which is a great neonatal unit, one of the best in the world. I would drive down there every day and stay with him for 6 hours. That unit requires that an adult be with the child every hour of the day. Well, there are only 4 of us, so we divided the day into 6-hour periods. On the way down there on a Wednesday, I stopped my little red pickup that I had at that time by the side of the road, and I started telling the father, he suffered long enough. He died the next day. You know the thought that came to my mind? What grief does to you? I thought, I killed him. My prayer killed him. 10 years later, I'm sitting in my son's big old F-150 pickup. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something. It's been bothering me for 10 years. I said, "What's that?" He said, "The day before James died, I was praying about how much he'd suffered, and he died the next day. I think I killed him." That's what grief does to you. None of that's true. But grief makes you think like that. It's all normal, folks. And I told Keith what happened. And we just sat there, and I won't tell you what we did, but grief, fellas. It's the same. It's not the same for everyone. We all react differently. Keith got angry. He really got angry. He told me, he said, "I'm a medical student. I should know how to save my own son." It made him a better doctor, incidentally. He knows how to talk to people, I think, better than he would have. But I don't know your experience, and don't ever tell me you knew mine, because you don't. Another myth. Watch it now. Be careful with this one. Some people believe it's wrong to talk to the person about their loss, about his loss. That's absolutely wrong. Let's talk about this a little bit. I always ask people, tell me what's going on. Tell me your story, or something like that. Tell me what's happening. I want them to talk to me. I told you when I told Billy that, he started telling me, Terry wouldn't talk about it for 3 years. That's her way, okay. But it is not wrong to talk about the loss. Jake, you're going to be in a hospital room one of these days, and the people say, "Let's go out in the hallway. Grandma's dying, but we want to talk in front of her." She knows she's dying. Talk in front of her. Why are you ignoring her at that last moment in her life? And in fact, if she's unconscious, she may still be able to hear you. We have some, I'll tell you another one I'm hearing now. Well, I don't want to take my children to the funeral home. I don't want them to see this. That child will feel psychologically left out, isolated, wonder what's wrong with him. Why won't mom and dad let me go see grandma? You hurt the child when you do that. He knows what death is. He's living, isn't he? We have some strange myths about don't upset the person by talking about his loss. Every time I've asked a widow to tell me about what she's going through, she starts talking about him or can't stop. She wants to talk about him. Just let her talk. Just listen. That is the furthest thing from the truth I can talk about today. They need to talk about their loss. They have to talk about it. They want to talk about it. Children grieve, folks. They do it differently from the way we do, but if we confuse them even more, we hurt them tremendously, psychologically speaking. They don't usually act sad or cry like adults do. In fact, they want to go up and touch the person or touch the flowers or whatever. That's all right. They are experiencing death too. They can play in the funeral home, seem happy, but talk to them about grandma for a minute and see what happens. They grieve. I'll tell you another myth. Well, I'll get to that one in a minute. Another myth. I'll tell you what you need to do, Cody. Stay busy and you'll be all right. Hogwash. You'll just be a busy griever. Hogwash is the Greek answer to this incident. I forgot to tell you. Keep a stiff upper lip, Cody. Be brave. You know, no, that's hogwash too. Fearlessness is not the absence of fear, fellows. Now, the last one. This myth. If we ignore it, it'll go away. No, it won't. Time itself doesn't heal grief, fellows. It's what you do with the time that heals it. The way I got around it, or through it, or something, was to go study thanatology and to learn how to help other people going through this process. I had thoughts, I had feelings. I broke down and cried the day of the funeral itself. Brother Josh, can you give us a report? Step up a little closer so I can even hear.
It was a pretty bad wreck, but I think all things considered, they think she just has a sprained ankle and a broken wrist. But they're taking her to the hospital to make sure that's all it is.
That broken rib is a tough one. They can't do anything but...
Broken wrist.
Oh, wrist, okay. Glad you clarified that.
The car's cold. I mean, from the looks of it, it's not as bad as it could have been.
Did she hit someone or someone hit her?
I think someone pulled out, from what it looked like to me, someone pulled out in front of her. She was heading westbound on Poplar. So, no one died, unfortunately. But the other car was roughed up too, so they're...
How's Epiphania doing?
He's a little shook, but,
What can we do to take care of the boys? Who's taking care of the boys?
my wife's picking him up from
Okay.
school, and, we'll take care of him until we know something.
You will feed them.
If I can.
Well, that's a bad... We had a report of a broken leg earlier, but it's a sprain and a broken rib. So she braced herself, evidently.
Yes, and I think her wrist broke with the airbag, but they don't think her leg's broken.
Those airbags are dangerous, aren't they? They can break your ribs. My daughter's wreck, it broke her ribs and her wrist with the airbag. Guy pulled out in front of her. What was I talking about? Grief is what's going on inside of you Mourning is the term used to describe what you're doing with that internal thinking. In our culture, many people grieve. They're not allowed to mourn, they think. And what you hear in this culture is cheer up, learn to cope, keep busy, get over it, and stay away from us because we don't like your pain, in other words. I want to suggest something to you. The result of these kinds of myths and the messages they send have encouraged a multitude of people, even in the church, to hide their feelings and their thoughts. They have suffered in silence by being strong, as they put it, and people admire that. They say the reason that people admire that is it doesn't bother them. They don't have to deal with it. And many grievers in this country have internalized this message from society that mourning should be done quickly and quietly and efficiently. I'm fine should be your answer to any question asked. But this type of pretense is causing drug addiction, alcoholism, broken marriages, dysfunctional homes, isolation, loneliness, depression. This country is going crazy because it's listening to the American Psychological Association. And in that association, the largest number of professional suicides are made every year. I want you to put in your notes Dr. Wolfelt's place of business. It's called the Center, that's W-O-L-F-E-L-T, Daniel Wolfelt. He runs the Center for Loss and Life Transition. It's in the state of Colorado. I forgot what, maybe Denver, I'm not sure. And he wrote in his last publication of Thanatos, which is his paper, that the most often comment he hears from people who are hiding their grief is, "I'm going crazy." Maybe we could learn to give people the time and the opportunity to grieve and stop telling them to get over it, shore up, chin up, cope. Let me say this another way to try to get this point across. Grief changes me. So if I were to get over it, I'd still be changed. It's impossible even logically to get over it. It changed me, made me something different. So to talk about resolution of grief or coping with grief or managing grief is ludicrous. Life will never be the same after death as it was before. So how could I get over it? It's not possible. You're now in a place of uncertainty. Even if you know it's coming. And here's an interesting study. I'm just going through this one again. We know now that when the person is suffering for a long time, that the grief is not as strong as when it happens unexpectedly. Well, you're in a state of uncertainty, even if the loss is an unplanned one or an anticipated one. You're still in the same place. You're not sure. You're missing a part of yourself, fellows. An important part of your life is missing. We need to understand that. He was sitting at the table with them the last time he would ever eat with them. And he told them, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. One of them even went so far as to say, I'll die with you. He said, you'll deny me 3 times in the morning. They are said to have gone to sleep with sorrow, as Luke's report, in the garden. They started crying themselves to sleep, thinking about what was going to happen. Grown men, grieving. The most important part of their lives was about to be gone. They couldn't fill that gap. And I can't fill it when I lose something like that. I suppose I could buy a new set of keys, but I'd rejoice if I found the old ones. I can't replace this loss. It's gone forever. We do heal, but we heal in a different sense. So write these 3 words for your, as we come to a close here today: loss, transition, change. Loss, transition, change. Let's help people face their feelings. They're real. We should not be afraid to let them express their feelings. Whatever they are, they're normal. We make mistakes in the pulpit. But if we're friends with these folks, they'll forgive those mistakes most of the time. And the best time you'll ever have with people is when there's been a death. You'll get closer to them at that time than any other time in your ministry. And Dorothy and I made a habit of going by the day after the funeral, and then a couple of days later even. We taught the brethren to take food in for a week or 2, whatever. If you're grieving, make sure you're taking care of your physical health, because you can lose sleep, you can get feeling sick, and so on. Depression is not a good state of mind for physical health. And don't ever let anyone tell you how you feel, and please don't tell someone else that. And don't tell yourself how you feel either. Well, I shouldn't feel this way. Who said you shouldn't? You ever been mad after a test when you lost a good grade? Who were you mad at? Come on, be honest.
Myself.
Oh, yourself. You're lying. You were mad at the teacher, weren't you? Oh. Weren't you angry with me the other day? Some of you were. Complain. You sure heard this class complain the other day you first got. But I found out they were only studying for the test, so we're going to change something. Plan ahead, fellows. Grief's going to trigger some strong feelings. I like that part. Do not tell yourself how you feel either. You can't lie to yourself. You're hurting. Admit it. Let me talk about this for just a moment. I got a call one night from an elder. Keith, you've got to come over here right away. Something's happened to Dot, his wife. When I went over there, she was sitting in the living room in a fetal position in a reclining chair. In the dark now. I said, Bob, we've got to take her to the hospital right now. She has pathological grief. The thing that triggered it was strange to me. I'd never heard this one before. Her daughter had told her that day, I'm expecting, Mom. And Dot started thinking, I can't have children anymore, and it drove her into a state of depression. Almost a complicated state of depression. If you see that, don't try to treat it, you can't. Make sure they get medical help. People who have grief remaining center stage at every moment of their lives have what's called complicated grief. And so if they can't possibly resume life, let's get them some professional help. We can't help them. We had a day when we moved in to the house where we were going to live that we were buying, as I went to work with the Lake Forest Church of Christ down here in DeSoto County. As we were unpacking, a fellow drove in the driveway, said, "Have you heard what happened to Richard?" I said, "No, what?" "He was just killed in a car wreck." Richard Martin. Richard had one eye, his right eye. This guy hit him from the left, so obviously he didn't see him. When his funeral was over, Doris, his wife, and I were visiting. She was at the house visiting. So I gave her all the platitudes of a young preacher. I just knew everything about this. And I said to her, "Aren't you glad that he was a Christian? I mean, we know where Richard is. He's in paradise." And on I went with all of my verbal Memphis school preaching platitudes. What the Bible said, right? She listened to all my carrying on and finally said to me when I got through yakking, "Okay, Keith, but what about me?" That's your ministry, fellows. You can give them all the platitudes. What about me? We need to strive to understand, not discourage this thing. Offer to take these folks shopping, drive them somewhere, whatever it is. Come in and make a meal for them, answer the phone, whatever it is. Go to the funeral home, make the arrangements. All those things are necessary. And ask the person to tell you his story. Let him tell you the story. Mourners, even children, have at least 5 needs, fellows. First of all, everyone who is grieving is confronted with the fact that the loved one will not return. Tell me your story. The opportunity to talk about the loved one brings that reality to the surface. And what happens now is you're not handling your grief alone. Somebody's carrying that burden with you. Now 2 people have those thoughts. I know who Delane is now. That means I've borne your burden a little bit. And so when you can, if it stays in here, it becomes complicated. When I can bring it out here, now the load can be shared with others. That's why psychologists try to get you to talk all the time. So we need to give people opportunities to talk about these feelings. So even a child, tell me about your grandmother. They love to tell you. Grandma was funny, one of them. One little guy said to me, he was sitting across the table from me and I was telling him these dumb jokes. He looked at me and said, "You're as suspicious as my grandpa was." I like that word suspicious. I thought you meant by it. Second thing, a need. You have to help them understand that those feelings of helplessness, fear, pain are real. Don't deny it. Don't repress it. Go ahead. It's all right. Think it. You're doing all right. Keep it. When I have these sessions in the churches, we start at 9 and go to 12. We have lunch. At 1 o'clock, the last session, I call the therapy session. That's where I try to get them to talk about their loved one. Tell me the story. That's how I heard Jane's story and so on. Those who are slow to heal, watch it, write this in your notes. Those who are slow to heal usually have idolized or glorified the person who died and are unwilling to confront the loss. Let's not be in denial forever. Let's learn what your feelings are. Tell me the story. Quote Galatians 6:2 for me, fellows. And so fulfill the law of Christ. That's your great value here. That's the third need. They need a family. They need a group. If you can, you could start a support group. We had one in South Haven. This Day Is Mine, it was called, and we had support for folks who were grieving, terminally ill, and so on. Let people talk about it, and you could sense when the group started talking and other people heard other people's stories, then they began to share theirs, and everybody was sharing the story. The burden became less oppressive. I don't know quite how to tell you this on this point. I'm trying to think of the words. What you're doing psychologically is trying to get the person, when you're trying to support this person and you're asking him to tell you what's going on, you're trying to get him to take his thoughts from the presence and put them in his memory bank. It's not so painful there. Because sometimes people feel disloyal to the loved ones if they treat him as a memory. No, that's where he needs to be. That's a big need, trying to get them to put that loved one in their memory. A fourth need. We have to help people understand that life has changed. It really has. And even your relationship to God may have changed. So let's not call that abnormal. I want to suggest something to you. I don't have time to go over this in detail, but there are special teachings that need to be done for parents and children. And I'll just suggest a couple of things here and then we'll get off of it. But when there are children in the home and someone in the immediate family dies, it's often a good thing to have family time where explanations are made to the children. And never tell a child something like this. Well, God needed another angel in heaven, so he took your cousin. That makes the child so fearful of God that he probably wants to run and hide. And that's no explanation at all. Remind the child that the family member had years on this earth, had his chance to experience life, and now has died. He's gone on, like all of us will. There's nothing wrong with the truth. And they need to be understanding, children do. They don't realize that their mom and dad are grieving too. They have to understand that. Daddy and mommy are as sad as you are. And it's normal for us to be sad now. You'll reassure children that way. Daniel Wolfeld told us in class one day, and I wrote his quote down here for you. Unfortunately, adults sometimes fail to respect properly the individual feelings of children. It is very important that adults carefully nurture the child's sense of self-worth, especially during times of loss. And he's written an article, and you can find it on the internet, Bereavement and Children. Bereavement and Children, Daniel Wolfeld. I'm not sure if Dr. Wolfeld's still living. I do know this was back 32 years ago. Pardon? No. Children do not automatically know why there will be a funeral. Need to explain it. And you can go with us. Just tell them, you can go with us. If they're small children, you'll have to tell them this is a time for sadness. We don't run around and kick a basketball in the funeral home. And I said earlier, the children who are not allowed to attend the funeral often express feelings of being left out, of being insecure. Well, let me stop a minute. I've got about 1,000 more notes, but were there any questions or comments or disagreements or? Yes, Jay.
What would your response be if you overheard an adult saying,
You'll have to speak louder. I'm sorry, hon.
what would your response be if you overheard an adult saying that to a child, that the Lord took your dad and he needed another angel?
Nothing in front of the child. I wouldn't say anything in front of the child. But if I had a chance, I would to talk to the person in private. If not, maybe they'll come to one of my seminars. I'd be very careful to say anything in front of the child because he just heard his parents say something. Okay? I think that some of us are becoming aware because of my work and my son's work that we don't say these kind of things to people. I'm hearing more and more people tell me they're working on what they say to people at funerals. So I hope that's true. How many of you went home Friday grieving? You didn't get your final grades yet? Well, you'll be grieving when you get them. Somebody lead us in prayer.
Please God. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day that you've blessed us with. Lord, thank you for men like Brother Mosher who have taught us well over the past couple of months, but specifically today. We pray that what we have learned today about grief will help us in our ministry and in the line of grief. We pray for our brother Evasion and his children as they're dealing with a hard time as Sister Carranza is in the hospital dealing with some pain. We pray that the doctors will do what they must, and we just pray for that family at this time. Thank you for everything you do. And it's in your son's name that we pray. Amen.
Good.